real problem is this, James. 2 decades, there will be 7 billion human beings on this planet. Most of them brown, yellow, or black. All of them hungry. All of them determined to love. They'll swarm out of their breeding grounds into Europe and North America. Hence Vietnam. An all-out effort there will give us control of South Asia for decades to come. And with proper planning, we can reduce the population to 550 million by the end of the century. I know. I've seen the data.
We sound rather like gods reading the Doomsday Book, don't we?
Well, someone has to do it. Not only will the nations affected be better off, but the techniques developed there can be used to reduce our own excess population. Blacks, Puerto Ricans, Mexican Americans, poverty-prone whites, and so forth.
I welcome this kind of examination.
You are free to do as we tell you. You are free to do as we tell you.
His head could be seen to move violently forward.
Back and to the left. Back and to the left.
That's why I don't read the newspaper. I'm a man. I'm 40.
What did the president know, and when did he know it?
I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency.
As of now, I am in control here in the White House.
This is crack cocaine from the White House. It could easily have been heroin or PCP. It's as innocent looking as candy.
Good evening, this is Mae Brussel in Carmel, California.
Anybody who's not willing to change based on what they learned is ignorant.
Coffee's for closers only.
I think we're giving you enough.
Go on to Chicago and let's win there.
Keep hope alive. Keep hope alive. Keep hope alive.
This is the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hi, this is Barbara Honegger. You are listening to Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm S.T. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing and traversing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, the court historians, and the textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight we have episode 128, Carmine Savastano on the Executive Action Program. Our guest tonight will be Carmine Savastano of TPAAK.com. TPAAK being TPAAK.com. He'll join us next in the midnight hour. First, however, let's clean this castle, if we shall. Now, I haven't given out the contact info for the show or the magazine in some time, so let's go ahead and do that. You can email me directly at midnightridernews@gmail.com. That's writer with a T. midnightridernews@gmail.com. If it is specifically about the magazine, you can email me at thegarrisonjournal@gmail.com, thegarrisonjournal@gmail.com. If you'd like to follow us on Facebook, we are at Midnight Rider News Show. That's at Midnight Rider News Show. And on Twitter, it is at MWN_ST Patrick. If you want to follow the magazine at Twitter as well, it is at Garrison Journal, not at The Garrison Journal. You can take the "the" out of there. It is at Garrison Journal on Twitter. So, Lulu.com, as you know, is the place to buy Garrison, LULU.com. And once again, even if you don't see those coupon codes on the front page, I highly suggest trying to type in LULU10. That's all caps, and the 10 is numeric. So it's LULU10 or LULU15, because I tried that the other night when I didn't see it on the main page, and it still gave me the 15% off when I typed in LULU15 with the LULU all in capital letters. So you might want to try that even if you don't see a deal on the front page, because it did work for me, and that was good. So see if that works. Now, it's a nice site, and you very rarely have to pay full price, which is also part of the reason why I've liked going with them so far. I don't know many people that have had to pay the full price if they sort of try to use the deals. The deals, as I said, usually go through. So if you'd like to support this effort and help us out, you can also please consider our Patreon page or the GoFundMe page. And rather than going through the longer links here, I'm just going to point you to MidnightRiderNews.com, where we have direct buttons that you can hit to go to both of those. Thank you so much to everyone that has, and thank you so much to everyone that's even thinking about it. Now, before we go to the break and get to Carmine, I want to give a bit of a plug to another show, which you know I like to do. I'm not competitive. I always talk about the Ocelli effect, and we'll do so with Carmine tonight. But I've listened in quite a few weeks now to Parallax Views with J.G. Michael. Now, most of you here listen on the Apple iPhone app or on iTunes, and it can be found there. But if you can't find Parallax Views with J.G. Michael, you can also go to parallaxviews.podbean.com. Now, J.G. does a really nice job with that show. He really has a command over what he's doing, and he has some intelligent guests on. You know, he recently had on our friend Joseph Green, and you know I love having him on the show, and he's always fantastic. And he was fantastic on Parallax Views as well. And if you get through that one, and you should, the Daniel Hopsicker interview, which is I think the episode after that, was also very notable. And make sure you listen to that whole episode because he has some really interesting things to say at the end. So check that one out as well. That's Parallax Views with J.G. Michael at parallaxviews.podbean.com. Really a good show. We'll be right back with Carmine Savastano.
Hi, this is Richard Jones of the Jack the Ripper Tour and the writer and producer of Unmasking Jack the Ripper. Download episode 27 of the Midnight Writer News Show and you will learn the truth about the Whitechapel murders that terrorized London's East End in 1888.
Carmine Savastano is the author of Two Princes and a King, a concise review of 3 political assassinations, and those 3 assassinations, as you can probably guess, are JFK, RFK, and MLK. And yes, that's where the TPOC comes from in TPOC.com. That's TPAAK.com. Now, he's a dedicated researcher, and he can be heard most often on the Ocelli Effect, the program hosted by Chuck Ocelli. So Carmine's been on with us twice, and judging from the download numbers, you liked him very much. So here he is again because, hey, we aim to please. This is Carmine Savastano. Carmine, thanks for being back.
Thanks, ST. It's good to be back.
Well, it's been a while, and before we get to executive action, I really do want to ask you about a few current events. I know you and Chuck do some current events work there on the Ocelli Effect. So I want to know what you make of this early primary season, because we still have well over a year left until the actual election, and the GOP has yet to really challenge Trump. Now, had you told me that 3 years ago, I would have disagreed strongly that that was going to happen. After all, if we remember, and we should, many of these never-Trumpers were mainstream GOP politicians. So I'm really more surprised by that than I am the fact that, that my local ham specialist at a Subway restaurant just declared for the Democratic ticket because, well, dreams really can come true. But what do you think of this incredibly crowded Democratic primary and then this relative dearth of Republican challengers?
Well, I think there are some legitimate people in the race, trying to be a candidate that has a chance against Trump. But unfortunately, I think that a lot of it gets detracted by some of the internal fighting. And I think that, and this, people would call me, as some are wont to do these days, a classical liberal for believing this, but I think that they're kind of bloodletting some of their best candidates. I think that as President or former President Obama said, they are engaging in a circular firing squad. They are so busy taking shots at each other that we are missing the larger narrative. Instead of giving policy, they're taking shots at each other and at Trump.
Oh, you're right, but don't you think there's a bit of a murky demarcation between the establishment and maybe they aren't anti-establishment per se, but the DNC favorites, we'll call them, and then the DNC outcasts?
Yeah, I think that exists to an extent. I think what a lot of it might be, and I don't want to go too far afield from what your question was, but I think that a lot of it also might be that there isn't a political exhaustion. I think that a majority of Americans are suffering right now. They're just tired of it. They're tired of hearing about it every day. Something I was talking to Chuck in an episode about was I challenged the media, and they still haven't done it, but I challenged them to go a week without saying the word Trump. Sell something without having to put his name in it, because that is feeding the process. That is really why I think that we can never get the president's name off our lips, is because the media is providing him a huge echo chamber. So, it's unfortunate, and I know it's counter to what a lot of the media wants to do, but it's almost like a parasitic relationship at this point. Because the media has gone from the loss model where they in the past used to lose money because they were more interested in gathering news. Now they've gone to a profit model. So to assure that the profit model happens, they need clicks and they need attention. And how do you get attention? You repeat hyperbolic things. Who says hyperbolic things?
Well, yes. I mean, of course he's the hero of hyperbole, Carmine, but that is what we begged for. And I mean begged for decades. And I know, before everyone out there starts screaming at their speakers and going, oh no, not me. I didn't want Trump and I don't want him now. One, I'm not saying that I ever wanted Trump. But two, how many times before 2016 did we hear someone say, you know, I, for once, would like a president who just says it like it is. I want someone who'll just stand up to people and say, you're lying. I want someone who won't be so controlled and will speak off the cuff and will just say what's on their mind. I'm tired of these presidents really just reciting speeches and phrases that have been written for them by speechwriters. I don't want someone so slick. I want someone who at least seems honest and is just straight with people. You know, I want the president to just talk like someone I'd speak to in a bar. Well, we sure have that. This is exactly what they wanted, or maybe in hindsight, it's exactly what they thought they wanted. And this is a theme for a whole other day and a whole other show. And it's something that my friend Donald Jeffries describes perfectly in Survival of the Richest. But Americans like these sort of mega bosses wielding power. You know, the culture loves mafia bosses. We do. We love people who just make things happen with the snap of their fingers. And as much as we don't want them to be our literal bosses, we love those kinds of bosses who just walk in and clean house. You know, the guy who just walks in and says, you're fired, to the people that aren't working. But in reality, that's the worst kind of boss. But we catapulted that worst kind of boss to #1 in the Nielsen ratings. We love that. So what should we call him? Blunt, maybe?
Or brash might be a better word.
Right. Okay. Brash. Well, we as a culture love that brash authoritarian who just says it like it is. And well, now, okay, we have him. He's in the White House. But that's what we wanted. And for everyone yelling at me right now, think back. Did you ever say that you wanted a sort of say it like it is kind of person in the Oval Office? I bet you did. But the question then becomes, so what happens now?
Yeah.
So what does happen now, Carmine? What exactly do we do with this?
And I think, unfortunately, not only I agree with a lot of what you said about. I don't think people foresaw the sort of person they actually wanted. I think they wanted those things, but they didn't understand the price that comes along with those things. That to have those qualities, you have to disregard a lot of reasonable ideas. To have those qualities, you have to ignore people trying to give you constructive criticism. You know, to be a strong leader, and every strong leader, if you look out through history, has that streak, that authoritarian streak. And the problem is, I think, is a lot of people who are opposed to Trump became authoritarians themselves.
You are so right about that.
They're calling for their own version. They think that everybody needs to be censored who supports them. They think, the people who do are deplorable. That's not the answer. That's not the way to fight it. That just makes it worse.
Well, that's exactly right. Left-wing authoritarianism and censorship is no better than right-wing authoritarianism and censorship. I mean, that's bad on both ends. But I'm also concerned that there's going to be a backlash to the Trump years, that one of them will be that we look for something say over-polished, which really means a push to the establishment middle for both parties. And for the Democrats, that would be a Joe Biden or a Kamala Harris. And for the Republicans, that would eventually be a swing back to a Mitt Romney type. And that is definitely not the way to go. I think, I always tell newly divorced or newly divorcing people that one of the big mistakes is thinking, okay, well, I'm getting out of something that went poorly with this kind of person, so what I need to look for next is the opposite. Well, not so fast on that. You're looking for someone who's ideologically strong, not someone who's the opposite of anything.
And it'll swing the other way. It seems to be like a pendulum, With Bush, it swung one way for 8 years. With Obama, it swung a little harder for 8 years. With Trump, it swung even harder and I know people don't want to imagine 4 more years, but unless, back to your original question, we're going to need a strong Democratic candidate to oppose President Trump. And I don't see them emerging yet because the others are bloodletting them. Like Biden was doing good for a little while there, but he's flawed. I'm not saying this isn't a question. Okay. And I think this needs to be stated too, and it never is. For the most part, not all, But for the most part, to get into politics, you've got to be a narcissist or a sociopath. Okay? I'm not saying that's all. There are some good people, but I'd say they're in the minority. I'd say the majority of people in politics are not doing it because they actually want to help people. They're doing it because it's influence, it's power, it's money. There's a lot of lower brain things that appeal to us that politics offers.
Right. And it's this idea of a specific kind of medal that really pads a strong candidacy. I think it's a valid one. And my friend Richard Bartholomew, he has a litmus test. Will you release all of the JFK files?
Yeah.
That's it. But for Lisa Pease, if you've been in office in California, as Kamala Harris has, part of her litmus test is, how have you treated Sirhan? And I think that's valid. But there are other difficult questions that need to be answered as well that would make a strong candidate. Will you drop the charges against Julian Assange? Will you release Chelsea Manning? Will you allow Edward Snowden to come home untouched? Will you do something to solve this problem of mass incarceration that is now has more people locked up in America than Stalin's gulags during World War II? Will you do something immediately regarding income disparity? What will you do if that's the case? I mean, it's way too easy to bash Trump at this point. You know, a first-year comic can do that with some sort of acumen. That's nothing. That's meaningless. How will you resolve these more serious issues of true freedom, of the permanent war state, of the indecent human slavery that is mass incarceration? How will you resolve these things?
Yeah.
That's what's important, and that's, to me, what can make a strong candidate.
Well, and I think the problem, too, is, and you can see this in, you know, if there was a reliable opponent for Trump, I'm sure you'd see this on the Republican side because it's been there before, but what you're seeing, too, on the Democratic side is candidates who have established themselves barely at all with a lot of money. I can't remember, was it Steyer? Tom Steyer, is that his name? Who went in, I think it was like 6 to 8 weeks from a non-existent campaign to fully formed with the 2% margin so he can be in the debates. And candidates who have been running for over a year who actually went out and built a campaign from the ground are not going to be in them. So how is that? How is that legitimate? How is that not the same thing that happened to Bernie?
Look, I think the DNC is wrongly playing all kinds of games with these candidates. You know, they're making George Washington look more right by the day, at least regarding, you know, the value or lack thereof of political parties. But you're right. You know, I see these candidates with massive online followings, candidates like Tulsi Gabbard and Andrew Yang among them.
Yeah.
But they aren't stamped acceptable by the DNC, and herein lies the problem. You know, I know a lot of Democratic voters across the demographic spectrum, a lot. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know one, not one, who is supporting Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. And then you're telling me that they're leading some polls? This is going to sound really simplistic, but I just don't believe it. I just don't. I think the polls are rigged, and I don't know how. I can't explain to you how, because I just don't know. I think it's much more complex than I think that we even know. But when you have Gabbard actually addressing many of those hard questions that I discussed earlier, and when you have Yang talking about a universal basic income to combat jobs that are going to be permanently lost or have already been permanently lost to technology, i.e. self-checkouts in department stores and grocery stores, just to name one, those are dangerous ideas to the establishment. Yet, when you look online, and online is supposed to be sort of a mirror of society, I mean, Facebook and Twitter to some degree is supposed to be a mirror of society, their followings are huge. Biden's and Harris's, not. And Yang's the only one talking about the real effects of commercial technology now. Only one. That has to be dangerous.
Yeah, well, and then we do have to have the ability for innovation. We're going to be wrong sometimes. We're going to screw up. I don't think we should put all our eggs in one basket as some more socialist-minded people might. But I do believe that we do have to have research and development. We have to have innovation. The only reason why we are in our current position is because of American innovation. You know, without, you know, everybody likes to, well, not everybody, but a lot of modern quote-unquote scholars like to attack a lot of the founders of various industries and revolutions that occurred in this country, but they do so with electricity provided by them on computers developed by them, with books that they read written by them.
Oh, you're right. You're right. And I don't deny that. And again, that's another topic for another day. So one more question on current events, then we'll go into executive action. I must ask you, what do you think about the Epstein story?
It's a mess. It's a, as one of my friends in the UK would say, it's a right mess.
Well, I can't deny that.
And to me, that I think it's funny in our very hyper-partisan times that it was this that is the unifying ground of Americans. The one thing we can all agree on is that there are questionable circumstances all over this thing. Now, that does not mean, and I tell people, it does not mean he did not commit suicide. There's every reason, unless we see evidence to the contrary, to believe that he killed himself in the end. But that does not mean he wasn't influenced to do so. That does not mean they didn't make conditions so horrific he wanted to and did it. That's still killing him. You're not doing it literally.
Carmine, if I was a betting man, no way he killed himself.
I'm not saying he had to.
Well, hey, before we go into executive action, let's go ahead and tell people how they can hear you on the Ocelli Effect and how they can read your work on TPOC.
If they want to hear me more on the Ocelli Effect, they go to ocelli.com. I'll also be, it'll probably be a couple weeks, but it'll be up at, you can actually, to see all my stuff, you can go to tpoc.com, tpaak.com. And I have all of my interviews, including the older ones with ST and Chuck Ocelli, Rob Clark, Mike Swanson and his show, The Past American Century. And all my stuff there. It's tpaak.com. And I will be, I mentioned this the other day too to Chuck, I will be putting on a donate button eventually. People keep telling me that they want to donate, but I just, I start writing and I.
No, you definitely should. I mean, you really should.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And, and I don't expect anything from people. I appreciate the interest. If they want to, that's fine. I can't stand people who are always trolling for money.
Believe me, I know. I mean, every few episodes or so, I have to make myself do it because I feel really squeamish asking for money at all. But you know what? This is a community, and I know that I personally appreciate everyone that's asked to be a part of the show or part of the magazine, and it's really the community that makes these things work, as you know as well as I do. So it's a chance for everyone out there to really be involved in what you do, to be involved in what we do. And I think that's important. I think allowing people to be a part of this very hard and what people don't really know, very expensive process is an important thing to offer them. So I don't think asking for donations is bad at all. And those who can help you and want to help you will help you. And those who can't will still like your product and they'll still like your work. And that's fine too. So take us to the origins of the executive action program itself. Now, I know it's going to end up being this overarching policy without a specific name at some point. It'll just be sort of how things operate within the agency, especially. But where does it all really start, and how did it begin?
Well, what eventually it became, because executive action got developed over in the United States much later than the origins were in the Soviet Union, is where the West basically got the ideas. I mean, assassination, if you look back, has gone on forever. You can go, Julius Caesar was assassinated. So it's a long series of state-authored or internal forces within a state authoring assassination programs. So what happened was the way that America developed its programs was we learned of Soviet programs that were occurring after actually prior to World War II, but we learned about them after World War II. So the term was usually reserved for Soviet use of assassination devised prior to the 1920s that later similar Western programs adopted for more limited usage. Such things as the Red Terror, in which Leninist forces murdered over 10,000 specifically targeted political enemies, helped shape the developing subsequent policy. During the 1930s, the practice of Russian state-authored political assassination would proliferate to include hundreds of thousands of Soviet victims. The NKVD, aka the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, launched repeated run terror campaigns organized by Joseph Stalin against the Russian citizenry who were deemed security threats. So that's where it started.
How did it progress through the Eisenhower administration and into the Kennedy years?
Okay, well, so after that, we find out about it. The U.S. finds out that the Soviets had sniper squads, and interestingly, including very skilled female snipers. which could get into areas that men couldn't during the war. So the KGB takes it over, and then we find out about it when the CIA starts reading about it in some of the Soviet documents, and some of the defectors revealed some of the information. They were called wet affairs, and they included using a varying system of methods ranging from intimidation via kidnapping, torture, assassination, and terrorism. The specific brand of executive action that was of most interest to the CIA during the 1950s amid the Red Scare was countering Soviet domination of such methods. And our leaders did not foresee a growing problem with the diffused responsibility among intelligence and military leadership that would cause repeated intelligence failures. Since it was difficult to locate the exact problems with the operations due to infighting and politics, many of the plans would fail. So they began here roughly in 1959 about. That's when the Eisenhower administration decided that it was going to use assassination against a national security threat who they believed Patrice Lumumba represented, which he was the prime minister of the Congo. I was just going to say Nixon had also suggested that we kill Castro the same year in 59.
Well, yes, we had multiple schemes and things by which to take Castro out, and that's Fidel Castro, by the way. But all of these plans failed because, well, I guess the worst intentions of mice and men can often go astray. But how does this really tie into ZR-Rifle?
Well, ZR-Rifle is basically when William Harvey takes over. So I'll just finish this up, and then we'll try to tie a bow to it. So the specific brand of executive action that we were discussing, so the earliest officials that authorized and utilized these illegal methods did not have the obsessive disregard for human life that America's enemy did. For the Soviets, no target was off the table. Anyone from the highest to the lowest peasant could be and would be executed. And American leaders decided to tweak that. Instead of going after large groups of our people, they went after groups of political enemies. So ZR-Rifle was contrived after, as you were saying, there were a lot of failed attempts on Castro and others. We sought to compete in an arena for valid security reasons and likely for irrational desires to beat the Soviets in every way possible. So this led to internal discussions in 59. And the United States discussed developing an assassination program. So, and this, I think, we're going to have to jump back in time for a moment. But basically, we're going to go where I think the birth of what would become these later assassination programs like ZR-Rifle that you want to discuss. And the birth is a study of assassination. So a study of assassination was a guide which I, in the past, referred to as the murder guide. And it offers a detailed series of proper circumstances, weapons, and use of assassins for clandestine operations, and offers details such as whether an assassin is intended to live or die based on the needs of the planners. So this now confirmed official descent into the intricacies of murder and concealing murders begins a journey towards later programs developed by leaders to assassinate foreign enemies. As the 50s wore on to the 60s, political developments and perceived or real communist gains in Africa, the Caribbean, and elsewhere incited Eisenhower administration desires to develop specific assassination programs. So they target Lumumba, they target Castro. They fail. The Congo, the reason why they targeted Lumumba was the Congo was a rich source of uranium for the United States, and the U.S. had mineral rights that could have been disrupted if communist-aligned leaders sought to remove us or if Lumumba wanted to nationalize it. So that's why he was determined a threat. Castro was determined a threat, obviously, because, less than 100 miles off of the coast, he led a country that was an enemy and aligned with the Soviet Union. So both were considered security threats. So what happens is after all these failures, so they try to kill Lumumba. It ends up, there was an argument in that instance where the station chief, Larry Devlin, said that he wouldn't follow the orders to kill Lumumba. But what he did was basically talk to a local military leader who didn't like Lumumba, and then they killed him. So he didn't deliver the poison, but the job still got done. It just got done via other means. In the case of Castro, who is I would say definitely a more significant thorn in the side of the U.S. establishment, dozens of plots failed, as ST mentioned. And this was not for any lack of the U.S. trying. We asked mafia hitmen to shoot him publicly, but the gangsters refused. Officials asked wanted to poison the dictator with a hidden needle in a pen that was never delivered. They created explosives in a conch shell while Castro went diving, but the chance never happened to use it. They lined a lethal paralytic disease in a scuba suit that was to be presented as a gift to him in a prisoner exchange, but later thought better of it. They considered dropping masses of airborne hallucinogenic drugs over a radio station he was speaking in Cuba to make him sound insane. Yeah.
Excuse me. I'm sorry. I was just going to say that when I think about everything that the CIA was doing in the 50s and 60s, only a sliver, which I think was uncovered by Church in the 70s, I do always wonder why. And I know it's a simple yet unanswerable question, but we've talked about the intention of dollar diplomacy. We've killed and ignited these coups all over the world to benefit these well-connected companies. And I do mean well-connected companies. I mean, your company and mine are not being helped by the CIA. But that doesn't mean that no one in the agency believed that they were doing it for Uncle Sam, for freedom over global communism in some way. And by that, I mean Russian communism more than the more isolated Chinese communism. And then, of course, there's this simplistic notion of control. They always say, well, it's either for control or for money. That's the easy answer. But this idea of control, this idea that this is some kind of risk game, and the idea is to win. But as we learned in the 1983 film War Games, the only way to truly win is to not play. And we had to know that, right? We had to know that someday, in some way, there would be some sort of backlash that would come when we were exposed. At least if not in America, then in other countries that we've toppled for United Fruit or for Standard Oil or for Halliburton or for whomever. So as best as you can discern, Carmine, what was the main intention?
Well, I think that certainly, like you said, there's going to be a lot of different motivating factors based on the person. But I don't think it's an amalgam. It really is. There is no one guiding principle. I think that changes from director to director, and you can actually see the powerful, monolith that everyone talks about now is not what it was during the 40s, 50s, and 60s. It was still growing. In the 60s, it was an adolescent, basically. It was an angry teenager trying to force its will on everyone. In the 50s, it was, a toddler, and it was an infant. In the 40s, it was barely formed out of, the remnants of the Central Intelligence Group. So I think that the real policies didn't get established as far as worldwide until the 70s. And I think that they were, as you said, it's part profit for some people, influence for others, power. It's a stepping stone for some people, like H.W. Bush. It didn't really serve as any sort of meaningful period of his life, but it allowed him to throw another star on his resume.
Who is William Harvey?
Well, William Harvey is an interesting figure, and the program that you mentioned, ZRRIFLE, was designed by him. William Harvey, I actually, in the references, there'll be an article called "The Man with Plans" that I included. I'll send those to you. He was, I believe, it was Indiana. Oh no, Ohio. He was born in Ohio, and he has an interesting life because now it doesn't matter because people have gotten beyond worrying about such social nonsense. But at the time, Harvey's parents weren't married. So he actually has his mother's last name, not his, or actually, he has his mother's last name, not his father's. So I think that might have affected him at a young age. It made him want to excel, made him want to prove himself to other people. So, and his mother was actually a very schooled literature professor. Her name was Sarah Jewel Harvey. And from that, he eventually went to Indiana University. And after getting married, he later joined the FBI, which is an interesting thing for those that are, have an area of the FBI, the CIA that they want to look at, to see the people that were in both. There's a lot of people, a lot more than you'd expect, dozens, in fact, that were in the FBI and then eventually moved to the CIA. And Harvey was one of them. Harvey was, I believe, his drinking that got him booted out of the FBI. He showed up late for work and was hungover, and Hoover wouldn't put up with it. So he gets booted from that. He then joins the CIA, where he is known as sort of a wild gun. He wants to try new ideas. And he does innovate some things. He's not, once again, we shouldn't just broadly paint every person as being just this storybook villain or hero. He was a person. I'm sure there were parts of him people liked, but unfortunately the parts most of us know we don't care for. He kind of made his name with the Berlin Tunnel Project during World War II. He helped, I believe he was station chief of, it was Hamburg or Berlin, I think it was Berlin Station, in 1954. He, after that, bounced around a little bit in various assignments until as ZR-Rifle would bring him back to prominence in 1961. So he takes the plots that were kind of haphazard and he militarizes them. He decides we're going to use a military-style executive action program, even stronger than the Russians, and we're going to train assassins. They never specifically in a lot of the documents say assassination. You have to go into some of the deeper files to find that, but it's for sabotage purposes, and sabotage includes assassination. So when you hear someone say sabotage, assassination is possible.
So how does Harvey rise through the ranks of the CIA? Is it because of his mind? Is it because of his skills? Is he just one of those guys that makes things happen and makes them happen efficiently? And who does he really latch on to on his way up?
Well, Harvey gets selected to redesign ZR-Rifle by Richard Bissell. So that's certainly one of the people that helps him come to further prominence in the chain, because he's then given charge of ZR-Rifle. He is also put in charge of Staff D, which is the cryptographic unit where they would go to other enemy bases or embassies. They'd break in, steal all of the code books, and then use them to decode enemy codes. So there was an implicit illegality in a lot of the things that Harvey did, whether it was assassination programs or burglary or whatever. Also, just in his normal assignments, he did illegal things. There was one little incident that I haven't heard a lot of people talk about before, but it's during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Despite that RFK had handed down to the CIA leaders to stop any programs to not incite the situation further, Harvey still sent in a few groups of saboteurs into Cuba. So if they had gotten caught, that could have sparked a war.
Well, and to take the side of the confused high school history teachers at this point, it is really difficult to teach Cuban policy in the 1960s. You have JFK and RFK, obviously, but then their intentions were often diametrically opposed to the intentions of the CIA. And then there are the intentions of the businesses and the intentions of the media, the competing intentions of the media, actually. And, of course, then you have the intentions of the mob interests, who at one point were hell-bent on turning Havana into Little Las Vegas or Las Vegas East. So when we talk about American policy, we aren't necessarily always talking about presidential policy, because what happens between all of these competing interests with these murky demarcations, that's really American policy. It's all of these things sort of mixed into one. And it was the same in the 1980s. You had one faction of the Reagan White House that was actually favoring Iran, and you have another faction that was actually favoring Iraq. So what was the American policy? Well, the answer is really a big shade of gray.
Yeah. Well, it's difficult to explain. I mean, overall, of course, it was a hostile policy. It was not definitely. We weren't trying, I suppose, to start a war by any means. I mean, the military wanted that. That should be considered in all things. Is that the military is always eager to go to war. The leaders of the military, anyway. Of course, not the people who actually have to fight it. But so the military is always eager for war. Most administrations usually take a more neutral stance. They don't usually necessarily get hostile with a termed enemy country like Cuba. What's interesting about the interaction between the Cuba and America, is that at one point American presidents and Americans were heroes in Cuba after we helped them in the revolution against Spain. But that all changed once, and in one article that people they want to look up, it's called "Killing the Wrong Castro," where I basically make the historical case based on the facts that it was Raul Castro we should have been going after, not Fidel. Because Raul was the communist influence. Raul was the philosopher. Raul was the one who convinced his brother that communism is the way. And Fidel was just the leader. He was the influence man. He was the face man. I don't think he cared about ideology in the beginning. I think he wanted to hold on to his power and establish Cuba as a presence.
Carmine, I could be wrong here. That's always possible, believe me. But I'm not sure that Castro was really optimistic about Kennedy's death, despite the attempts on his life that had really taken place under his watch. And if you really believe that the buck stops at the Oval Office desk, then Castro could have, theoretically, taken some kind of satisfaction in the assassination. Yet I've always heard that Castro was really pessimistic about an LBJ presidency.
Yeah.
That despite how he felt about the CIA and their own attempts on his life, and the mafia and their own attempts on his life, he really liked Kennedy personally.
Yeah, I think that was pretty much an international feeling. I think a lot of people, maybe, I don't know about all, that might be an overstatement, but I think a significant amount of leaders around the world really did mourn President Kennedy, and they did not want Johnson in charge. Because Johnson is sort of like a precursor to George W. Bush. He's the cowboy of the 1960s. You know, he's someone who, unlike JFK, where JFK might attempt to read some context into a situation, Johnson wasn't a big context person.
No, I think LBJ was indeed a very literal person. I think that's a pretty safe assessment. Now, you talked a little bit about cryptography, which brings us to QJWIN. Now, we had Casey Quinlan on the show a few months ago, and he said that he thought that QJWIN was Otto Skorzeny. Now, I've read TPOC, I've read your side, and that's not something with which you agree.
No. Well, and I want people to understand, I wouldn't just make the claim. I also have evidence for it. And the evidence is not gathered by just me, but like the basis for QJWIN, I'm sure, as you know, ST, and anybody that's looked at the case for a while has heard that QJWIN is a name that's popped up over and over the decades, and people have assigned multiple identities to this person over and over through the decades. And sooner or later, each of those prior identities was debunked or didn't have any evidence. Now, well, the reason why QJWIN is important is because QJWIN is the primary agent that was recruited by William Harvey during this period to serve as a potential assassin. Now, QJWIN was a European who the CIA provided false documents for so that he could go to Africa and set up a false business, and from that false business use it as a cover so that he could gather intelligence and possibly be used to kill Patrice Lumumba. Now, QJWIN was never used for that. It turned out that Larry Devlin instead went to Mobutu Seko and had him do it instead. So, but the program was still there, the QJWIN program. Now, QJWIN or QJWIN-1, as he's referred to in some of the files, was the lead agent of that program. Now, some people have tried to say that thus, because he was an assassin, because he was being used in 61, that somehow means that he is related to the JFK case. It doesn't. It's a totally separate issue. It is related to the assassination of Lumumba.
However, is it possible or probable that he was linked to the JFK case?
Anything's possible, but not anything's probable. So I don't assume. That it's an assumption to make. And so here's the reason why I can say, as you know, some people might believe he's Otto Skorzeny. I can tell you why he isn't and why he actually is. I don't believe this is him. This is him. And I can prove it with about a dozen documents. So QJWIN is Jose Marie Andre Menkel. Now, I say this based on his CIA contract, which is linked to the article that I'm going to have for ST in the reference section. It is in multiple documents where they refer to him as Mr. Menkel. It is that his wife got a reimbursement from the QJWIN funds. It is, let's just say, there's a lot of reasons why it's him. And all of them are verifiable. Now, in contrary to Mr. Quinlan's claims and others' claims, the Otto Skorzeny story relies on documents which cannot be accessed by the public, were purchased at an auction, and are being held privately. I don't just take someone's word for it. They need to provide evidence. I have a dozen documents, and documents that were gathered by other people, such as John Newman and Bill Simpich before me, before I even got involved in the case, that helped establish what he was doing and where. So I'm going to go with the documents and not with what they believe.
Well, there's also another figure which we haven't heard as much about as we've heard about QJWIN, and this is WIROGUE1.
Yeah.
Who was that?
Well, so WIROGUE1, which I always thought was interesting with the new movie. I was happy that it gave us a little boost when we put the article out. But WIROGUE1, I think, is even more interesting, and it's because QJWIN got such prominence, a lot of people paid more attention to him. And it's not that he isn't interesting. Mankel's an interesting character, but this character to me is more interesting because of what he actually did during his life, not just that he was later used for the potential assassination. His name was David ZRRIFLE, and he was actually stateless. He was from a family that fled Georgia after the Soviets took it over, and became his parents. One left with his sister back to Georgia, and he would never go back to Georgia because he considered it Soviet hold. He hated communists. He basically blamed communists for breaking up his family. His mother, in her sorrow from her husband leaving, kills herself, so he's alone as a teenager. He goes on to be thrown out of like 18 different schools as an orphan, but somehow he's intelligent enough, and he never gets a degree or anything. But from each school, whatever classes he actually likes, he takes a chunk of that information and basically stores it in almost a photographic way in his memory to where he can utilize it later on. And for instance, he later on he develops, even at one point while he's in prison, engineering inventions from an engineering class he took when he was a kid. So he does that, and at one point in prison, he trades one of the inventions to one of the jailers so that he can get better conditions for himself and his friends. So he's highly intelligent. He then, during World War II, while he is working for a German official, is also running a resistance group where he is teaching himself forgery, which is actually successful for a couple of years. So he was actually pretty good at it, even though he created, off the top of his head what it was supposed to look like. He comes up with new paper trait techniques that he ends up selling later.
Wow. Yeah.
Eventually, amazing. He ends up in while he's working for the German officials, he's also helping the resistance. So he eventually gets captured for that. He's trying to create a certain type of explosion, and in the explosion blows off 2 of his fingers. Yet he's still able to continue his forging somehow. So he gets captured, he goes to a concentration camp, and the day he's supposed to be killed, he convinces the commandant that he has an idea for an engine that can run without gasoline. He uses this idea to get himself transferred closer and closer to the front, and then before they kill him, the Americans free him.
Huh. Well, so at this point, we have to ask ourselves why, right?
Yeah. Well, he's an amazing character. I mean, it's to me, I don't think they appreciated what they had on their hands. They thought of him as a criminal who could be, and he was a bank robber. He was a criminal, but he was also a genius as far as some of the things he did.
Well, that brings up an interesting point. This line between good and bad, between friend and enemy, it's really like taking a foot and scraping this sort of less than precise line in the sand. It's very wide, and it doesn't exactly have a beginning. It doesn't exactly have an end. There are computer hackers that cut into the government's toughest mainframes, and now they're government employees at that hackers plant in Pennsylvania. And then we have the obvious Operation Paperclip, which brought Nazi scientists and propagandists to America. And of late, I think about Al-Qaeda. We could literally fire at an Al-Qaeda fighter in Afghanistan and then fight right next to him in Syria. It's a bizarre way of choosing allies for sure. So we see this all the time. No one is bad and no one is good. Everyone is usable and then everyone is expendable.
Oh yeah. Well, and it's totally, one of the unfortunate tropes you're going to hear sometimes in the JFK cases, people say, well, the CIA would never recruit someone like Oswald. That's nonsense. The CIA, and I can verify this, you can go to my site and check it out. The CIA has recruited torturers, Nazis, insane, literally insane. And I'm not talking about, well, you see, no. Schizophrenic was on their file, and they still used him. So sometimes an insane person can serve a purpose. Sometimes a person that seems unlikely can serve a purpose that we don't understand.
Because it's a controllable weakness.
Yeah, it's a weakness. It's a way to control them.
What's the most important thing that we as researchers should know about WIROGUE1?
I'd say the most important thing about WIROGUE is that they could have used him for so many other things. He actually sold engineering ideas and plans and developed new inventions and sold them to various European firms. But what's interesting about I'd say here, and that actually made me think of another thing. I think there's a link on either Who Was WIROGUE Part 1 or 2 that'll be in the references to a show I did with Chuck, and we talk about it's a little bit longer that we go into it, but I think what we could talk about that would be interesting is that his life it's so crazy that how he ended up where he did in the manner that he did, and that how in the files that I have on him, you actually get to see the CIA guide him. Normally you don't get to see the handles be put on to a subject when they're going to have him do something. But in his files, I actually found one of the psychological breakdowns where they have the psychologist telling them what buttons to push. So you can actually see how his hatred of communism, for instance, his desire for a parent because his father has fled and his mother is gone. That's how they use people.
Well, that's the absolute brute strength of subtle influencing, personal influencing.
Yeah. Influencing to me is definitely, it's subtle influencing that is truly can be frightening rather than the overt. With the overt, usually you know where they're coming from. It's subtle influencing that can have people doing things and not realize they did them for a decade later, that it wasn't actually their idea, that somebody else had gotten them to do it.
So what kinds of things are interesting you right now? What are you working on?
Well, right now, I'm working on another book that I'll definitely in the future, when you have time, come back and discuss with you. That it's going to concern. Basically, it made me ask a bigger question. With political assassinations and even just intelligence in general, is why do we do these things? I mean, I understand the need for intelligence. I understand national security and why we're going to have certain programs, but the question is why do we as humans feel the need to kill other humans? Why does it occur to us? Why is it kind of ingrained in our societies where there's actually systems? Just that there are treaties and contracts set up for how war is waged basically means we've codified how to kill people. And I'm not judging that. I'm just saying that is the reality of the situation. So what brought that about?
Well, that sounds interesting. We'll definitely have you back on. So let's go through this information again. Where can people hear you? Where can they read you? Where can they find you? Okay.
You can find me at tpac.com, tpaak.com. You can hear me here, of course, on Midnight Rider News. You can hear me on The Ocelli Effect with Chuck Ocelli at ocelli.com. You can also hear me on the Lone Gunman Podcast with Rob Clark. And that's at tlgp.com, I believe, and at the Past American Century, which you can find at YouTube or wallstreetwindow.com.
And this has been Carmine Savastano, the author of Two Princes and a King, tpac.com, tpaak.com. Always a nice guy, always says yes when I ask him to be on, and a friend of the show, absolutely. Hey, Carmine, thank you so much for being on again.
Oh, I appreciate it, ST. It's good to be back.
I'm ST Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show, and I'm going to get this show up ASAP. So, that said, from the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.